So it's with great pleasure that I introduce John Thanassoulis and Alan Morrison. John and I go way back to the MPhil in economics, and I have to say, our paths kind of diverged. I'm very surprised to discover us working on similar things again, just partly because I moved into philosophy whilst John moved off to work with NERA and then came back to academia and took my old supervisor's chair at Christchurch before being poached by Warwick Business School. And he's now working on regulation together with Alan Morrison, who also did his time outside of academia in consultancy and in derivatives trading, amongst others. Derivatives, actually, I don't know if you're a trader.
Not a trader.
You was a trader. There you go. Before being tempted back to academia and the Saïd Business School. And together they've been doing work on regulation in banking, in particular the effect of ethical standards. So, yeah.
Okay. David, may I stand up, or with all these cameras, do you
absolutely.
want me sitting down?
No.
No? Okay, that's great. In that case, I'll stand up. So, all right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. So I'm John Thanassoulis, and you just heard from Alan. So I want to talk about ethical standards and cultural assimilation in financial services. And we'll certainly have discussion at the end, but we can also have questions that you have. Please feel free to ask as we go through. So I'll introduce it in a minute, but let me give you a sort of a little, very brief overview of what to expect and the tools that Alan and I are seeking to deploy in this question. So what Alan and I are essentially mathematical economists. We're interested in game theory. We're interested in understanding contracts and where they come from. And contracts don't just come out of nowhere. Somebody decided that the contract that bankers and other people in financial services labour under is a good idea. It was a good response to the pressures that those people face. And those contracts will contribute to incentivising certain behaviours. They will contribute to cultures being created. And we've seen all sorts of scandals that have come out as a result of that. And so what Alan and I want to do is to understand why, let's take as an assumption, which we will, that actually before people become bankers, they were humans, they did have a moral compass, they were made nervous by moral dilemmas, and they didn't set out in life to be deliberately the antithesis of ethics. Why is it that we've had so many failures? And to understand where those contracts come from, how they contribute to them, what cultures they would deliver, and ultimately what danger signs a regulator might spot, and how a regulator might want to, ultimately the Holy Grail might want to enforce certain types of contract perhaps to try and ensure that the culture that we get is one that we're happier about. So to set the scene, there's no shortage of bankers facing moral dilemmas and coming out of the moral dilemma seemingly on the wrong side of it. So here, let's start with some easy ones. So IEX, has anyone heard of IEX? I didn't pick the most obvious ones. I'll get to the obvious ones in a minute. Does anyone know what IEX is? Okay. IEX was a platform, was an exchange in America, and the special thing about it was that it put in what's known as a speed bump. So there are these high-frequency trading algorithms that try and make money off other people by being just a bit faster. And what these people said is, no, this is creating too many mugs of people. We'll put everything in speed bump so that you collect everything. Speed bump was minuscule. It was like something like 5 millionths of a second. They'd collect all the orders over 5 millionths of a second and execute them at that time. So that in a sense it would be fair, because nobody, for 5 minutes of a second, nobody can have that little bit of an advantage over you. So there were a lot of people, a lot of clients that were saying, I want my trades carried out on that exchange, please. And what this book was all about was the bankers receiving these instructions, explicit instructions, and ignoring them. And saying, yes, your trade will be carried out on that, and no carrying out on the other trade. And guess what? They also have high-frequency algorithms themselves and are able to profit, no doubt, from the clients that they were purported to be serving. So here's one example of a moral dilemma. Can make some money, explicit instruction from the client, put it on that trade, it being ignored. Another moral dilemma. Okay, you'll see where we're going when we get to the modelling of this. So on the left we have an abacus, and there was a quite famous deal that Goldman Sachs did called Abacus. Alan is an expert on this. What was going on in this deal was that somebody, a guy called Paulson, went to Goldman Sachs and said, I want to take a bet on subprime mortgages going down. How can we do that? How can I do that? Goldman Sachs essentially got somebody else, a different organisation, to put together a bunch of these subprime mortgages, which the first guy, Paulson, wanted to make the bet, was fairly sure they would go down. And then they went, not telling the third party, they went and found a mug on the other side. They found a number of mugs. One of them was ABN AMRO, who weren't told about Paulson and the whole link. ABN AMRO thought they were in with a fair chance, decided to commit nearly $1 billion to it. They lost. Then they were bought by RBS, and then that all went sour. So that was the sequence of events. And I suppose now, as Brits, we can savour that particular loss. Again, Goldman Sachs at that point being placed in the situation of having a moral dilemma. Okay, I could go on. This one is PPI, a very British example, payment protection insurance. On the retail side, this isn't just wholesale bankers doing bad things. Retail people were also doing bad things and having moral dilemmas and coming out on the wrong side of them. And we can talk about that in due course later. Okay, so I could have gone on. Okay, there's no shortage of scandals, no shortage of bankers who, are maybe they're just innately bad people, but they are facing moral dilemmas, and cultures are being created whereby there's malpractice going on, whereby these people are doing bad things. There's another one of mis-selling passive management as active management. So what do we, just taking a step back before we then say, well, how are we going to model this and try and understand why does this come about? And you'll see it's not as trivial as you'd expect, and the results can be quite surprising. So when Alan and I sort of sat down to reflect a little bit on what do all these different myriad examples tell us, we sort of thought that there were 4 points that were important to think about when looking at this problem. So one is that cultural standards and tone from the top seem to be very important. It's not enough just to have supervisors with formal regulations. That we did have formal regulations, including now, some of these scandals, for example, active management being sold as passive management being sold as active, is just happening right now when there's been lots of regulation and lots of focus. It's very difficult to regulate and just the regulator tell you you'll behave because there's someone watching you all the time. So tone from the top seems to be important. Nonetheless, despite this focus, there seems to be some endemic feature of banking which means it's prone to these problems. Certainly there's a lot of quite important commentators and people in public life. President Dudley of the New York Fed through to the Pope and the Archbishop of Canterbury have all spoken about cultural failures in finance. There is a consensus that pay and these incentives are part of the problem. The amount of money that some of these people earn is very large. The bonuses are very substantial. Is it just as simple as, everyone's just paid lots of money for doing bad things, so they do bad things? And the reason why that's not so obvious is, if it was that obvious, wouldn't the customers anticipate that? And wouldn't that mean that maybe it wouldn't be so profitable? And where does this cycle finish? So there is something to be understood here. And behavioural problems, there seem to be something about banking. There's experimental evidence, Ernst Furr, which has spoken, that maybe there is something about finance in particular which makes this prone. We'll expand on that perhaps a bit later. So, what are we going to do? Well, to give you an idea of where this is going, what we're going to do is we're going to try and sort of model the inside of a professional services firm in a way that's sufficiently simple that we can get a handle on it, to try and understand why a principal, a board, people representing shareholders, would they wish to create a bad culture. Okay, so how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to then, to try and model the inside of a financial services firm, we're going to have actors who care about and have an ethical compass. And I'll define that in 2 different ways through this talk. Okay, you'll see it in a little bit. Okay. The 2 ways I'm going to look at are broadly inspired by a Benthamite notion of act utilitarianism, and I'll define all these much more fully. And there's another one which is more of a duty-based, which comes closer in its inspiration for us to Kant, but we'll define what we mean when we get there. It's more of a duty-based ethic. We will have in our firm, we will have a principle which you could think of as the board or shareholders who have to decide, right, how are we going to incentivize our bankers? And there's going to be two types of bankers. There's going to be some experienced agents, perhaps they've been working for longer, they have a better idea of how harmful some of these practices are and what's right and what's wrong. So they know, look, if we missell, if we ignore the client who says put this trade through this IEX platform, how much are they likely to lose? They're going to have a better idea about that, and they'll also perhaps have a good idea about how much money and profit and bonus they stand to make. But they have a fuller idea of just how bad some of these actions might be. And there'll be agents who understand less, perhaps newer people into banking. Yeah.
Sorry, could you just clarify that? When you said they understand what is right, the example you used was that they understood what would happen if they took certain actions.
I really mean that. It's more that they have a better idea of the costs and benefits, not that they're more ethical. Not that they're more, indeed, no, and indeed there might be pressures so that they would become less ethical. But no, it's just that they, if you like, understand the world a bit better, so have a better judgment of just how bad is this going to be. They might care less, maybe they couldn't care less, but they'll know more. Okay, and so we'll have some that know a bit more and some that know a bit less, newer people into industry and into finance. And the newer people will be looking up to the senior people and will be deciding whether or not they want to emulate them. So that's going to form a culture if they decide to emulate them, or it might be a dysfunctional culture if they decide, you know what, my boss is bonused up to the eyeballs, and the fact that he does this doesn't tell me anything about how moral, how ethical or not it is. He would do it, wouldn't he? He's going to make all that money from doing this. Perhaps I won't copy, or I will copy. We will explore those sorts of issues. Okay. So that will lead to culture. And understanding all this, the principal is going to think about how to design contracts in this setup, what incentives all these agents should get. And then those bankers are then going to go out and try and do business with, perhaps with sophisticated customers, perhaps with unsophisticated customers. And who they're serving will give us a different insight into how good or bad culture might become and what are the pressures that lead to different types of culture in an organisation. Okay. Let me set a few things up and then get you to some interesting results. Okay. So, I said that we want to think about these moral failings. Okay, and so we're going to model people, our agents are going to have an ethical dilemma. There's going to be a practice, we'll just call it P for practice, which is going to be potentially harmful to the customer, but potentially profitable to the firm. Okay, at the same time. So it could be very harmful to the customer and not very profitable, or the other way round. You know, one can imagine that there are costs and benefits. So just like the not obeying the instructions about the IEX platform, there's a cost to the customer, there's a potential benefit to the firm. If I sell you an investment product and promise you active management, whereas actually all I'm going to do is passively manage it and never look at it again, there's a benefit to me in that I don't have to spend any time on this. There might be a cost to you if I'm just ignoring what's going on, and you know that costs and benefits. Well, they might not, you know, do.
I think it's a benefit if you get your funds passively managed.
Well, indeed, you know, and some of these things might
charge 5% for it.
No, and some of these things you can imagine. Some of the practices. This doesn't have to be malpractice. It might not actually be sinister. You can imagine a customer saying, "I definitely want you to do X," and the banker saying, "Look, I really do believe this is a bad thing for you. You know, investing in farmland in Ukraine is just not a good idea at the moment." And you know, and insists, and you know, perhaps he still doesn't do it, even though he says he would, and goes and buys farmland in Azerbaijan or something, if that's better. So anyway, so then we've got moral dilemmas. How are we going to think about the ethics of this? Well, ethics. Many of you, ethics is something which is, to give it its formal title, it's essentially contested. People have been arguing about how people resolve ethics for a long time, a lot longer than Alan and I have spent writing this paper. So how are we going to deal with it? Well, we are going to, as I say, there's not virtue, Aristotle and so on is an important way to think about ethics, but not one we've got anything to say about. It's very difficult to model that. We are going to build a lot on a utilitarian tradition, due initially to Jeremy Bentham, where an action's right if it increases the aggregate level of individual well-being. And we'll define what we mean in our context. So we're going to have moral agents who might see ethical decisions in terms of, is this act increasing the aggregate level of individual well-being, or is it not? And if it's reducing it, it's unethical, it's a bad act, I shouldn't doing it, I feel bad if I'm doing it. Of course, you pay me enough. Maybe my willpower is sufficiently weak that I might do it anyway, but we'll get to that. And we'll also think about a sort of a more of a duty ethic, so the more of an ethic that doesn't depend on the context, where some actions, some practices are just wrong and you shouldn't do them. And that will be a different type of ethic that we'll look at, inspired by a Kantian categorical imperative. So how are we going to do that? So more formally then, we're going to have our agents, and agents like money, that would be the standard homo economicus. So the utility of an agent, I haven't got a pointer, so you just have to look at the pink box at the top. The utility of the agent is increasing in W, which is how much they get paid. Okay, they like money. So that bit's standard. What isn't standard is we're giving these people, we're putting something in the utility function here. We're giving them a moral dilemma, and we're saying, look, I don't like, we get utility from the E term doing if it's ethical. If what I'm doing is also a good thing to do, that I like that. And epsilon is really the willpower, which is going to vary between 0 and 1. So if epsilon was 0, that's the classical case. That's like, ethics are fine, but actually I just maximize my utility. If epsilon is 1, that's like some sort of saint who's only interested in ethics and is not at all corrupted by money. And I imagine for most of us, the epsilon somewhere in between, and where exactly it is, it captures how ethical we might be. And so the example we're going to spend most time on is where we've got bankers who are these act utilitarian types, which is that they see an act as ethical if it increases the aggregate surplus. The change in the surplus due to their act is something that they like. If that's positive, then that becomes an ethical thing. If actually it's negative, then that becomes a bad thing. So if their cost is to the customer is outweighing any benefits that they're getting, then they start to feel that this is not the right thing to be doing. That is an unethical thing, and of course it depends on their willpower. We'll also look at more of a duty-driven ethic, where look, as far as the ethic part of my compass goes, I just shouldn't be doing things that harm the customer. Okay, there isn't the surplus, the extra profit that's being created to the bank. I take that out, and we'll get to that. You get to different outcomes if people behave in that way, and principles respond to those sort of ethics in a different way. So why? Yeah.
The harm to the customer, is that a indicator variable 1 naught, or is it actually a continuum?
It's a continuum. And that's something that the experienced agent will have a better but not perfect grasp on.
I thought it was a feature of Kantian ethics that they might kind of switch on and off rather than be determined to the size of the harm to the customer.
Yeah, and so that's why we're calling it duty-based rather than just a straight count. I think that's right. I think that certainly other people I think would share your view that there's just like a sort of a fixed pain there should be from doing an unethical thing.
Doesn't your story create a boundary? It's a story of do no harm.
So there's traits. So because we're trying to model, if you like, something real, and I'll get to. We haven't. I'm going to focus much more on the act utilitarian, and you'll understand why in 2 clicks, or even But I personally actually feel much more comfortable with the idea of a trade-off because of the willpower element. You could just make it so there's a fixed amount of pain, as it were, from doing this, and I've got a willpower, and then as I change the money, as long as I pay you a penny more than is required, you just ignore the Kantian thing. But somehow, I guess it's not a purely my intuition is that that's not a good model. Now, That's my intuition, but it's founded on some empirical work. So let me tell you why we're going to focus quite a bit on the act utilitarian case. So the cheap argument is that we come at this as economists, and many economists have used essentially a Benthamite notion by associating welfare with aggregate surplus. Total welfare is equal to the sum of producer and consumer surplus. So that is sort of quite well accepted. More to my liking is some work in business ethics that actually went out and actually said, right, well, let's just see what sort of ethics people have. Let's give them surveys and ask them to respond what they would do in situations of a moral dilemma. So here's one. Okay, so you can read that. Okay, so it's a bribe, right? It's a moral dilemma that says you can't break into a market, Asian market, somebody rings up your company, the product that you have is going to create, if you will, a lot more value in that market. Would you pay the bribe? Okay. Now, then, so this was given to businessmen, actually 2, I think 3 times, and it's all been written up in Journal of Management, Journal of Business Ethics, and so on. And philosophers have tried to categorise. They give them choices and they tick, and then they describe a little bit as well, free-form words. What did people say? So more of a Kantian response would just be, bribery is wrong, no. A more nuanced response would be things like, well, it's a cost of doing business. Well, if we don't do it, somebody else will. Well, the quality of the product that we're going to give and the utility consumers are going to get out of it will far exceed the bad thing that we have to do to get into the market. So the net, it's a plus for the people of the Asian country. And so you can see just what proportion, whether people are more act utilitarian by trying to make the trade-off or more Kantian. Well, can you guess? The vast majority turn out to be act utilitarian. We're willing to engage in trade-offs, says the evidence.
They've described it as a consultancy fee and then get on with it.
Well, that's one way of doing it. Well, that's okay. That's how you get engaged in the cover-up. So that's the okay. So anyway, so there's the reference of I think the first people to do this. Anyway, so there's empirical evidence that suggests that the way managers really do engage with these moral dilemmas is in a more act utilitarian sense. Having said that, we're going to also look at a more Kantian-inspired duty-based ethic, modulo your good point.
Do you really think that they're being utilitarian rather than coming up with a palatable excuse for something they know to be wrong? And that Kantianism doesn't give you an excuse, but utilitarianism can give you a bit of a cover-up.
According to these surveys, they're more willing to do it when they find it easier to justify when the surplus that their act produces is bigger. So harming somebody for $1,000 they won't do, for $20,000 they will, even if they're not getting the 20,000. So it's not perfect, but it does seem that it's not a side constraint thing. It looks like a trade.
Okay, so there are examples here that benefit the company.
There are examples where you're just thinking about somebody else is making a profit. That makes it a bit better.
Right.
Then this assumes no detection, no sanction, no detection, no sanction.
Well, what we're going to do assumes that no detection, no sanction. But that's not a very, essential detection and sanction. Remember, these people are all, that has an expected cost. So it's like, if I do this, I get paid all this, but I might get found out and fined. And so, what's the probability of that? Times by the expected fine, you just take it away. So in a sense, it captures it, and the principal can then just raise the pay by that expected cost, and you're back to where you started from. So it actually doesn't change a great deal. Those things. So we're sort of going to abstract from that, but that's a very good point. So what do we actually do? I want to gauge some results, but you do have to build up a little bit of structure to be able to get into this. So a little bit more formally, and I will skip over most of the formal bits, but just so you have an idea of what the building blocks are. So I've alluded to this, and this sort of spells it out a little bit more. So we're going to have a principle, which you should think of as the board or somebody representing the shareholders. Profit maximising, no morals in that sense. Employing 2 agents, these are financial services agents, you can think of them as, to provide a service to customers. And there exists a practice, a bad practice, P, which an agent can invoke privately. And if they do so, it raises profits with some probability. However, it may harm customers either a lot or a little. Okay. And those are the sort of things we talked about. So the agent faces a moral dilemma. Do I invoke the practice or not? And it's in a messy world where the probabilistic profit gain, there's a chance it won't be so big, and we don't know just how painful it will be to the customer. There's a chance it will be very painful or it won't be painful. None of these things are clear. So in a world of uncertainty, which is quite realistic, we have a senior agent and a more junior agent, and the senior agent has a better knowledge of the harm which can be caused by this practice. So a better idea of whether it's going to be a costly practice or not. The junior agents can observe the adoption decision of the senior. Okay, so we've got the opportunity for cultures to form here. The junior can observe the senior and can decide, look, the senior knows a bit more, and they've decided to invoke the practice, or they've decided not to invoke the practice. Do I wish, therefore, to invoke the practice? So that can create cultures. Where does the principle come in? Well, contracts, as I started this talk by saying, didn't come out of nowhere. Okay, so the principal is in a position to affect what the senior and the junior do by choosing the remuneration, by choosing the bonuses and choosing just how incentivized these people are. And that's going to allow them to sway the choices. And then the consumers, who ultimately the money comes from the consumers buying the products, they might be sophisticated or they might be naive and not know very much about the practice. And so then the question is, what behavioural norms would we see? Would we see cultures developing where the juniors copy the seniors? Will the juniors copy the seniors into doing the bad thing, or will they not? How will the principal respond? All of those questions we'll be able to say quite a lot about as we get going. Now, there is a literature. Yeah?
Sorry, just a question on the moral setup.
Of course.
You made the comment that the uncertainty was to be realistic. Do you also need uncertainty to have hidden action, have contract theory, all that kind of thing? Does the uncertainty, is it a useful modelling device as well as being realistic?
Yeah, well, so yes it is for a number of reasons. So if you had no uncertainty, then in a world like that it'd be very easy for the principal to get what they want. Because they could just say, right, I want to see you've done the practice, because if my profits aren't high, you haven't done it. Okay, and that, it's things of that nature where it then all just sort of collapses and people just get ordered about, all right. We think we're quite original. There is a literature, but there is essentially very little on this question of sort of moral dilemmas and this element of philosophy meeting contracting and actually trying to formally model it and understand how contracts are going to respond, rather than just taking contracts as they're and sort of lamenting them, actually understanding why we see those contracts and what sort of cultures we're going to get. We think we're essentially pretty unique. Okay. All right. So I've told you about the model, a little bit, just a little bit more about the model. I don't want to belabor, just the minimum amount, so that you can see how we're going to build up to the results, because the results will be quite surprising. In fact, I'm going to really, I think, cut down this, so I don't want to do too much. So, senior, junior agent, okay. Do I want to tell you how much of this do you need to know to be able to understand what's going on? Very little, except for some of this notation. Okay. So, we have a practice, and this box is the only one I think that you really need to listen to be able to get the gist of what we're going to say. So what's going on in the practice is the practice can raise profits with some probability, okay, and so that's and the probability it actually does anything is captured by that delta p, and the extra profit that you generate is captured by that delta pi. And it might be harmful, this practice, to the customer. If it is, it will hurt the customer by an amount C. If it isn't, it won't hurt the customer at all. Okay? And what we don't know is, the key thing is, just how likely is this practice to be a harmful one for the customer? Okay? It's either harmful or not, and the probability that it's harmful, okay, so we've crystallized it right down to just what is the probability that this practice is harmful. That's this variable h, which the agents are trying to learn from. And if the probability of harm is quite low, then this isn't going to be a very bad practice. if the probability of harm is equal to some critical level, then the expected cost to the customer is equal to the expected gain to the firm. And if the probability of harm is above that level, then we expect this ex ante to be a harmful practice. All right. Now,
Harmful means worsen bentham overall welfare.
aggregate surplus reducing.
Yeah.
Aggregate surplus reducing. And so what's going to happen? Well, we've got time t equals 0. As the practice is there, the principal's got to work out remuneration schemes. Make take it or leave it offers to the customers. And then each of the agent acquires a customer. The senior agent, who knows a little bit more about the practice, gets a signal as to whether it's high or low, a high cost or low cost. That senior agent decides whether or not to invoke the practice. Subsequently, the junior agent decides whether or not to invoke the practice, and then the contracts are executed, the customers get their benefits, and we see whether we've got something bad or good. All right, let me gloss over how you go about solving this, okay? Because I'm sort of mindful of time. I want to have a discussion. I want to take you through all this. I'll just spend a moment on this diagram because it actually captures an awful lot. Okay, so allow me to just take you through what's going on in this diagram, because this is sort of at the heart of the model. So what's going on this diagram is sigma is what signal does the senior receive? Let me do it in. So the senior knows a bit more, and that extra knowledge is captured by this variable sigma. It captures just a signal as to just how likely this practice is to be bad. So sigma captures the extra noisy knowledge that the experienced agent has. Okay? And so given that extra noisy knowledge, the senior gets to update, knows a bit more, and has a more accurate view as to how harmful this practice might be. Okay? And then the senior has to decide whether or not to invoke the practice. So as you can imagine, if the senior gets a signal saying, look, this practice isn't very bad, okay, low probability of harm, likely to invoke. If the signal is that it's actually quite a bad practice, the senior is likely not to invoke, right? So that's when the junior observes whether the senior has done the bad thing or not. The junior is going to then reflect, okay, how bad do I think this practice is? How likely is it to be harmful? And that gives us two other curves. Okay? The bottom one tells me if the junior observes the senior doing the practice, how harmful do I think the practice is likely to be? Not very. It's a lot lower than the other one, that HJ0, which is, gosh, if I see the senior not invoking the practice, so even the senior decides not to do it, what do I conclude about the likelihood that it's harmful? Now, that updating is going to depend on how was the senior incentivized in the first place. And that incentivization feeds its way into the cut-off point where how bad a signal does the senior have to see before he says, okay, maybe I won't do this, because it really is quite a bad thing. So if the senior is heavily bonused to do it, then the senior would only reject the practice if he saw a signal like right up there, gosh, this right, almost certainly is going to really, really be harmful. And then, so that tells me if the junior sees the practice being invoked, it doesn't really tell him a great deal. It's like, well, the senior would do that, which is why the HJ1 is right way up there. So what that creates is three regions, okay, where we can the principal can either put us in a rejection region, meaning the junior will always reject the practice, because even if I see, the best the junior can see is that the senior decides to invoke this practice. But the senior was such a corrupt individual anyway, that doesn't give a good enough impression that the junior would want to do it. So down here, if the principal puts contracts down here, they create a culture of rejection. The junior will just reject this practice, and the senior can be incentivized to it or otherwise. At the top, we've got a culture of acceptance. The junior is paid so much to do it anyway, almost doesn't care whether the senior does it, like bonused hugely and will just do it. And in the middle, we've got a cultural assimilation region where the junior is rewarded in such a way that they will decide to copy the senior. So if the senior sees that extra information, decides to invoke, then the junior says, well, if it was good enough for the senior, I'm going to do it too. Otherwise, they won't. So I haven't shown you enough of the model for you to be able to really get that, but I hope you get the idea. The idea is that the senior knows a bit more and can decide to invoke the practice or not. That will depend upon their pay. The junior gets to look at what the senior did and thinks about their own pay and decides whether to either copy the senior, so that's cultural assimilation, or actually their pay is such that whatever the senior does, they were going to do one thing or the other thing. And if we're in that situation, then the culture is essentially broken because we're not getting the junior looking up to the senior. Okay, so what's going to happen? All right, let me not take you through the optimal contracts because I want to take you through what actually happens. So, having glossed over all the details, and there are lots of details, what happens if you've got sophisticated consumers? Okay, so we're in a situation, we've got a moral dilemma, we've got agents who can do a bad thing, it will raise the profits of the firm. The principal has the tools to incentivize that, can bonus people, and that will outweigh their moral scruples if necessary. So we're thinking about the act utilitarian. So people are reflecting on, look, if I do this practice, how much likelihood of harming the customer, likelihood of increasing profit. If the aggregate surplus is going to go down, I don't like doing that, even if it does increase profits. Okay. And we're going to start with sophisticated customers. So those are...
Could I just ask, you've talked about the factors governing the behaviour of the senior agent and the junior agent. What's governing the principal, the board, the shareholders? Is that simply profit maximisation for the firm?
Just so.
No concern with having a moral workforce at all? Just
none whatsoever.
Right,
This first part. We will go to that in a moment.
Right.
There's one other thing. There's clearly a long-term profit implication in reputational risk.
Well, you could think of that as being captured by... So if it's the case that this practice, the long-term reputational risk is so large that it actually lowers profit. So this is a practice which harms the customer possibly and harms
the senior
profit.
experienced guy can factor that in.
Yeah, so, well, and the principal in that case just wouldn't want to incentivize this at all.
So, and you...
Depends when he retires.
Okay. Well, so in that more sort of long-term view, let's suppose that we really have a net present value maximising. Okay. So imagine that the board is representing long-lived shareholders or a pension fund or such.
So you've got in here, the probability of being captured or being discovered, therefore, is in his expected return.
Yeah.
So that's if you've got a 50% chance of being discovered, and you're
and it's sort of there, and it remains a practice that we'd still, the chance of being discovered times by the cost of discovery are such that this still remains a juicy thing to do.
Right.
Yeah. So.
What's the relationship between the junior and the senior?
Well, so that's entirely endogenous. And I glossed over it. It's a very good question. So the principal can create. The senior goes first, and then the junior. So the relationship is, as far as the junior is concerned, the junior looks up to the senior, sees the invocation or not, tries to make the inferences from it about how bad this thing is, and whether or not to do it. As far as the senior is concerned, the senior is aware when working out his own pay. The senior is aware. Look, I could affect the actions of the junior here. And in doing so, that might affect my pay. If I'm bonused on whether the junior succeeds, it makes lots of profit or not. That's endogenous, right? The principal can do that, can make that link, or could break that link. And it so happens that if the principal wants cultural assimilation, the principal would wish to create that link. And the optimal type of contract would be one where the senior bonus depends upon the junior also having high profits, as well as the senior. That is an outcome, and that does happen in cultural assimilation. That is the way to generate. I wasn't going to give that result, but that is part of it.
It's always the board that decides what contract.
In this first benchmark model, yeah, the board decides.
Seniors cannot decide on the contract. Cannot.
In this first part that I'm explaining to you, I'll get to that in a minute where they can, but no, to be absolutely clear, it's the principal decides on the contract for both the senior and the junior.
Is there it implies a positive culture really.
Does it?
You have a positive culture going on where the senior is aware of what the junior is doing. But if the junior is actually gaming the senior, it may well be that the senior is in a position of knowledge, and a lot of harms result in areas where the seniors don't know what the juniors are doing.
Well, that's a really interesting point. I haven't thought about it very carefully. Can I come back to that at the end? Because I might have had the chance to.
Very fundamentally goes to the key of control.
I think that is a very interesting point. So just to be then clear, here you see the setup.
It's a positive culture area.
Quite so. Senior first, knows a bit more, but not everything. Goes first, the junior can see. Okay. Right, sophisticated investors, they know all this and they can see. So what's going to happen? All right. Perhaps it's surprising. Remember, we have a principal here that has all the tools that you'd want. They've got bonuses, they can incentivize at will, they can overpower the moral scruples of any of the agents that they choose to do so. Would they choose to do so? Well, when the customer's sophisticated and the agents are apt utilitarians, what happens? Do we have big bonuses? No, we don't. The principal would optimally decide to set wages equal to the outside option, here normalised to 0, irrespective of the state of the world. What does that mean? That means the sigma star is what is the critical threshold of badness, if you will, at which the senior decides to invoke. It is exactly the one that Bentham would want. It is the one where the signal is this act is just looking like it's going to become aggregate surplus reducing. At that point, the senior would decide not to do it. And we'll have cultural assimilation, where the junior copies the senior. So we have, with sophisticated customers and a principal which is only interested in profit, agents who have some moral scruples but are not saints, we have a moral firm. Okay, now we're going to caveat this shortly, but it's important to understand why. So why? Because then it will help us to understand where things can go wrong. So what's going on here? Okay. So we've got sophisticated customers. What's going on here? So customers are sophisticated in the way that we often write about in economics, which means that they work out all the equilibria, as they always do in our models, and are not willing to pay more than their expected benefit of the practice. Okay, that's what it means to be sophisticated. You can't be ripped off as a habitual part of an equilibrium. So the sophisticated customers pay their expected income, or expected benefit, which makes the principal the claimant for all residual surplus. Okay? Because the surplus, the principal will obviously have to pay the wages of the employees, of the agents, but any extra money that is accrued will accrue to the principal, and if the principal loses money, that will come out of the principal's pocket too. Okay. Now, if we just forget the agents for a minute, what would the principal want? Well, the principal would like to maximise profits. That's what we said. So the principal needs to get the customers to pay as most money possible. How can she do that? Well, she needs to deliver a surplus which maximises, she needs to deliver behaviour which would, if she could, maximise aggregate surplus. Because that would trade off the benefits of increasing her own profit as against the costs to the customer, which the sophisticated customer is going to push right back on the principal. The idea being here, I know you're not, I know you're going to ignore me when I say put the trade through IEX. I wasn't born yesterday, so I want to have a cheap price for this, please, Mr. Bank. And, if not, I'm not going to deal because I'm expecting you to rip me off, and I don't get ripped off in equilibrium because ex ante I get the reward. Now, if the principal could just order people, that's what she would want to do. But how can she order people? Well, because every agent, they're not a saint, but we endowed them with some ethics, not zero. Arbitrarily, if you like, close to zero. We are talking about bankers after all, but not equal to zero. They have some willpower. They remember what ethics were. In which case, okay, but the principal wants to, if possible, if it's not too expensive, induce aggregate surplus maximising behaviour, i.e. not to swamp the weak ethics that the bankers have. So, how can you do that? Well, you'd want to pay a flat wage, and in here, you just want to set it equal to the outside option, normalised to 0. You wouldn't want bonuses to ensure that the morals are not corrupted. And so, if you think about it, a flat wage of 0 encourages the agents to just pick the action, do the practice only when it's aggregate surplus maximising, which is exactly what the principal wanted so as to maximise her profits in the first place. And so that becomes the optimal contract. So it's sort of a bit bizarre. It had us scratching our heads. How robust was this? But it is in a sense, a bit like the first and second fundamental welfare theorems. It sort of tells you what bits maybe are interesting by telling you, look, if you make everything work in the way that it says in economics, caveat emptor basically works, is what this is saying. If you left these financial services firms, if they're supplying sophisticated customers, the customers can look after themselves, expecting that the firms would not be using bonuses to corrupt people. If there was some moral hazard, so you had to incentivise some effort, you'd have to put some bonuses in to get the effort, but there'd be a cost in terms of losing money because of their practice being invoked too frequently, and the principal would trade those off and wouldn't want, be in their interest not to have the bonuses too high. So we wouldn't have malpractice here. We've got the caveat emptor working. Okay, perhaps surprising.
Except, I don't know, I slightly am taking issue with your calling some moral firm, because it's moral in the sense that the overall surplus is maximised, but that's almost like, well, surely ABM would be a bit pissed off if we told them that Goldman's were a moral firm, because overall, including Paulson and their transaction fees and everything, the surplus would be maximised. I mean, the client might still not see it as very moral.
ABM would be pissed off, but Jeremy Bentham would be happy.
Yeah. So that back to the question of what would be an appropriate ethic, and regulators will, So if we were talking about a granny being ripped off by Paulson, then I think the regulator would be with you 100%. Would be like.
But isn't it? I mean, this point. I mean, the Benthamite critique is that I mean, you compare individuals. I mean, A and B.
Yeah.
B gets hit, but because A gets more, they're better off. And you sort of answered that by saying sophisticated investor, but they can be sophisticated but not have full information. So in your case, the ABN AMRO didn't know that Paulson's the other side. So ABN AMRO, however many analysts they have, it's not a sophisticated person. So it's not being paid. So it does get ripped off.
Yeah,
and we'll get Goldman and Paulson were not moral.
Yeah, and there's lots of ways. And information will matter, and we'll come to that. Absolutely, and it does matter. You do need the information to get.
So if ABN AMRO had been told that Paulson's the other side, you can each take a bet.
Then they might have come out much more square, and we could have just relaxed. Yeah. So that's I think that's true.
It's worth mentioning. ABN AMRO did know that Paulson was on the other side. They didn't know who the portfolio selection agent was.
Yeah, okay, but they
there
thought
was some
done.
lying about how the portfolio was created.
But that was where the lie was. All right, so let's drill a bit more. So there was, before we saw the result, there was some nerves in the room about why is the principal just interested in profit? Surely the principal, we wouldn't be. Am I making this my life too easy here by saying that? So let's delve into that a bit more. So we think it's a good benchmark, which is why we started with it, that the principal is only interested in profit. And we find that this unethical, if you will, principal still runs essentially an ethical firm in terms of its outcome, and Jeremy Bentham and so on. But perhaps then it would be even more so if we had an ethical principal. So one who didn't just care about profits, but also cared about the practice in the way that we're talking about. So how can we model that? So here's a simple way of getting to that. So suppose that we have the principal, we're going to stop sort of collecting people, we'll now make it an owner-manager. So we had the senior is in a position, we had endowed we have in the paper, we'll call her. We had endowed the senior manager with ethics, in other words, a moral compass. We'll let her be the owner-manager, so she can decide on the contract of the junior, and gets the information like we did before, and cares about ethics in the way that we described. Okay. So our prior was, well, this would be a really ethical firm. So just to be sort of clear what's going on. The senior is the owner-manager setting the wages of the junior and the prices at which the customers will be paid. And the senior then receives her signal, decides whether to invoke the practice, and then and the junior observes that, decides whether or not to invoke the practice. The culture can be formed and just as before. So what happens? Okay, well, working it out is I'm not going to take you through this. Working out is not trivial, but it's possible. Essentially you just have to track what everyone is believing about what everyone else is doing. Okay, because we now have a senior who is ethical, who's in a position to decide how they're going to respond to the signals that they get, and obviously that's going to affect what the junior does, it's going to affect what the customer does, and those beliefs have to be tracked through, which is what this diagram would tell us. It doesn't matter. Okay, so what happens? Well, suppose that both agents are actually utilitarian, just as they were before, and that the willpower of the senior, is not a monster, and she's not a monster, and neither is she a saint. She's somewhere in between. And the senior agent is the owner manager. Okay. Well, if the junior agent has a weak enough willpower, then we can guarantee that this will be, if you will, a less ethical firm. It will over-invoke the practice. We'll have too much of the bad practice, and as a result, okay, so whereas before we had the aggregate surplus maximising amount, now of the practice, now we're getting our ethical owner-manager is just doing this too much, and we have an unethical firm.
Getting the comparison in my head, what was the willpower of the junior in the previous case?
It didn't matter.
Why is that?
Because in this previous case, the fact that they had any willpower at all was sufficient. What a little bit of willpower means is that the junior would like to do the aggregate surplus maximising thing, and that's exactly what the principal wanted then, when they were just concerned about money.
Why does just a little willpower work in that earlier case, whereas the willpower is a kind of continuous influence on the...
So just to be clear then, in the previous case, it didn't matter what the willpower levels were. It was a completely general result that you got the aggregate surplus maximising amount of the practice. Here...
Why is that there and not here?
Well, there, because the principal, it turned out that the equilibrium was what the principal wanted to do was exactly incentivise the agents to do that which they would find ethical. So the little bit of willpower pushed in the same direction. Now, ethical owner actually finds herself, trying to incentivise something the junior doesn't want to do, i.e. to be unethical. And the more willpower the junior has, the more expensive that is, and if their willpower is strong enough, it's just not worth doing it. But for a large chunk of time, we will have our moral owner, our ethical owner, running, if you will, an unethical firm. Bizarre, you might think. What's gone wrong? Okay, so let's see what's gone wrong. Okay, so the problem here is who's the residual claimant? Okay, so whereas before we had the principal was the shareholders, they were the residual claimants, and they determined the contracts. So before, how could they make sure that behaviour was good? Well, they limited bonuses right down. Now we have an ethical owner-manager. Now the ethical owner-manager is the residual claimant. So the ethical owner-manager can't insulate herself from the fact that, if I just over-invoke, profits go up. That's bad, I feel bad, but profits go up, and that I feel good about that, and I've got this trade-off. And so now, because the owner-manager can't insulate herself from this extra profit, she becomes tempted to just over-invoke a little bit. The customers anticipate this, of course, but the principal, the owner-manager now, finds herself wanting to over-incentivize the practice because, yes, she cares about ethics, but also she realizes that she's now going to, all the profits come her way, and however moral she is, unless she's a saint, that is going to essentially lead her astray. Okay, so sophisticated consumers and an ethical owner, excessive invocation of the practice, and that therefore means bonuses have come in. Okay, so what we also find is that, so bonuses have come in. All right. So that was one way in which now we have malpractice. So an unethical firm, profit maximizing firm, sophisticated customers, everything was great. Think of an ethical firm, if you will, one that has morals. Well, if you might be moral, but if you're also exposed to the profit, so the owner, if you will, then you're going to be led astray. Okay, because you can't, if you are part of the decision-making process, then that's going to lead to excessive invocation. Somebody said information. I think perhaps it was you, sir. And information turns out to be very important too. So here's a different extension. Okay. So suppose that we have, back to our benchmark model, principal, senior, junior agent. Okay. And we've assumed that the customers, our sophisticated customers, have a great deal of information. Let's just reduce their information just by a little bit and see what happens. So let's suppose that they don't observe the remuneration contracts. So they can't be sure exactly how bonus the people that are serving them are. What happens now? Okay. Then, okay. So what happens now? Where are we? So we can look and try and work out under what conditions can we be sure that we're going to have a sort of, if you will, an ethically run firm. If we're going to have the aggregate surplus maximising amount of the practice. Well, for that to be the case, there's got to be no incentive for the senior to be encouraged, bonused a little bit more. So remember, we're in this extension, what's going on? The customer doesn't see the bonuses that the agents are getting. So there mustn't be an incentive for the principal to say, you know what, let me just give you a little bit more money if you make a bit more profit. And it mustn't be an incentive to deviate for the junior to get a little bit more money if he delivers a bit more profit. Those two conditions mean that you can get to the point where if either of the agents have a sufficiently low willpower, the only thing we've changed here is the information, then this no bonus, no malpractice equilibrium can't be sustained. We will have too much of the practice. We will have bonuses and too much invocation of the practice, and that's the corollary. So information does matter, and even a little change, just not being able to see. So even if you know everything, you know just the willpowers of the people, you know the practice exists, but you just can't see exactly how highly bonused people are, then we get back to the excessive amounts of malpractice. And the reason is that the firm now is caught in a prisoner's dilemma, which is, if they could, they like to say we're a really honest, ethical firm, but they're deviating and just over-incentivizing the agents to just do a little bit more of the practice. Can't be observed, and so they can't resist the temptation, and so this unravels. The customers know it's coming, and so we get too much of the practice. Okay. I want to talk about the Kantian type, but I'm just going to conclude the act utilitarian type by just going to the other extreme, just saying, suppose that the customers are completely naive. Now what happens? So they don't know about the practice. Now the one break on the principle was that the customers didn't want to pay too much money if they can see this coming down the line. If you take that away, the principle now, the only break that's left is the fact that the agents don't like being forced to do bad things. But everyone has their price. And so if you are serving naive customers, then with the senior agent's willpower sufficiently low, then the senior will be incentivized to over-invoke the practice. And you can say a little bit more, okay, which is that now, whereas before cultural assimilation was what we would have, the junior copying the senior, when you're serving unsophisticated customers, essentially what happens is the principal identifies who has got the weakest willpower and bonuses them, because that's the cheapest way of getting invocation of the practice, getting the profit maximizing thing going on. And so you can have cultural assimilation, or you can have acceptance or rejection. They're all possible, because the principal will sniff out the cheapest way of maximizing her profits and just put the bonuses there. And so what that means, very quickly, what that means is that profits, if you're serving naive customers, the ones who don't know about the practice, are clearly declining in the ethical commitment of the agents. Profits would be higher if you can get agents with less ethics into those roles. So that naturally then would lead to a simple extension in terms of who's likely to get these jobs in the first place. Okay, and so if we're serving naive customers, then we can explain dispersion of cultures across firms, which we couldn't do with the sophisticated case in the everyone knowing everything. And now the sort of the senior-junior distinction is broken when we have these acceptance or rejection regions, because the junior is just not interested in what the senior is doing and will behave either accept or reject depending upon their remuneration contract. So the culture in that sense becomes dysfunctional. We can explain that too. So that leads to an interesting little empirical prediction. Okay, which don't know if it's true or not. It'd be interesting to know. So the financial advisors then, tasked with selling services to sophisticated customers, ones who have all all this information, our prediction would be that those financial advisors should have a lower ratio of bonus to fixed pay than those financial advisors selling to unsophisticated customers, where you would expect to see big bonuses or big, basically, sales commission.
Third variable, which is the information variable.
So the information. So here I'm assuming that the information term is totally C. Okay. So if you keep the information the same or not, you can weaken my result on the sophisticated case if you like I showed. But if they can see or they can have a good idea of just how bonus. Okay. And sort of I don't know, but I would love to know. So Goldman Sachs famously was selling CDOs. They were only not just doing ABN AMRO. We had the question mark about whether or not they knew who had picked the things, but they were selling just CDO derivative contracts to European civic councils. Councils in Norway were famously buying these things, as well as to investment banks in New York. You'd sort of expect that the New York investment bank should be more sophisticated customers than the. Okay, you're shaking your head. If you don't buy that, then you wouldn't buy. But it would if you do.
Because I've read the book.
Oh right. But if there was a difference in the sophistication, then we'd have a prediction as to how bonused they should be. All right. I want to allow time for questions, so I'll just run through another 5 minutes or so. Yeah. Just a quick bit on duty-driven agents. What happens with duty-driven agents? Okay. Well, inspired by Kant, but we are going to interpret, as I say, as a duty not to harm the customer. So what happens in this case? Well, if you've got sophisticated consumers, so now what's changed now? We're just doing everything again, but we're just supposing that people have these duty ethics where perhaps it's not utilitarian, although the evidence would suggest that many people are like that, but just don't like harming the customer, and that features in their utility function. Well, in that case, if you have sophisticated customers, now you do see bonuses, because you'll actually find that the principal will incentivize the senior agent to invoke the practice, but less than the aggregate surplus maximizing amount. So if you were an aggregate surplus maximizer, when your agents are Kantian in that sense, duty ethic, not to do things that harm the customer, we have, if you will, too little invocation of the practice. It's not maximizing aggregate surplus. Perhaps Kant would say it was never meant to. But that means, but we do see bonuses in this setup. So we do see bonus contracts and wages which are positive. And what's going on here is that all the intuition about what maximizes aggregate surplus and therefore profits hasn't changed. But the difference is that the agents just don't like doing the practice full stop. So they don't want to do it. You have to bonus them to do it at all. And it's not worth bonusing them so much that you get up to the aggregate surplus maximizing level. The reason being that imagine going a little bit away from the aggregate surplus maximizing level, there's a first order reduction in the amount you have to pay these people to do things they don't want to do, but only a second order change in the profits basically because of the aggregate surplus. So it becomes worthwhile doing it a bit less. Yeah.
But saying that essentially means that your agents are still making utilitarian decisions, because you say you have to bonus them as much, and that's just again a utilitarian decision, because they do it in the end because they get enough surplus against the cost they bear?
It's a willpower decision. So they know the ethic part of their utility knows that this is bad and it's just a straightforward negative. But the expression everyone has their price is that they've got willpower. They know it's bad, they shouldn't do it, they feel terrible, but they've got family to feed. Yeah. So they're not saints. Is that utilitarian? Well, it's a willpower thing. I mean, I think people have written about.
They're not
willpower.
proper Kantians in that they know they shouldn't do this and yet they do it anyway. But the things they know they shouldn't do are the things that Kant tells them they shouldn't do. And then if they have weak willpower, they do it anyway and they feel dreadful.
Or a bit of it.
A bit of it, yeah.
Well, until they see their background.
Yeah, we can't go away from the fact that we want. If we just have sight constraints, none of this is interesting. So they know what they shouldn't do, and then if you pay them enough, they do it and they feel bad.
Yeah, they're not saints. They're not. I mean, what you're grasping for is a Kantian agent who just doesn't care about what they're paid. Like, I shouldn't do this. It just doesn't matter what you pay me. They probably wouldn't be in these jobs.
Well, he hasn't got the right. His will doesn't work, right? He knows what to do, and yet he does it anyway.
And here, whereas before we always had cultural assimilation with sophisticated customers, now once again we can have all three regions. So rejection acceptors are also possible, as well as cultural assimilation. I'm going to finish with a couple of pictures, just so you get the idea of what's going on. Okay, I've told you the intuition, and so what I'm going to do here is we can actually sort of just solve out and say, right, although it's complicated, just what would the principle for particular parameter values, and you can read in the paper, you can see what they are. How would this all pan out? So what I've got here is for sophisticated customers, sophisticated consumers with duty ethics, and I've got here what would the junior agent do. So along here are the willpower of the junior agent. So 0 is he's a homo economicus, only care about money. 1 over here is the saint who only cares about the Kantian thing, never do it. And over here is what is the willpower of the senior. Okay, so over here the senior again 1. This senior is a saint, only cares about the Kantian thing. Up to 0 at the top only is homo economicus. Okay. And so you can see it becomes optimal. So there are 3 different regions. The principal will decide on where to put bonuses so as to engender these situations. The vast majority of it, but not all of it, is cultural assimilation, where the junior will copy the senior. We'll see what the senior will do in a minute. There is a region at the top where the senior is not very ethical, but the junior has very high willpower, where it's just cheapest to just say, you know what, junior, you just reject the practice. You're so precious about it, let's just don't bother doing it. Okay? And over here, where the junior is just interested in money, we could just leave the senior out of it, and the junior will is just incentivized to accept the practice. What's the senior doing whilst this is going on? Well, the senior's trade-off is captured by this surface. It's quite complicated, but you'll see what's going on in a minute. And this is telling me what I will reject the practice if the signal that I get that it's harmful is too high, above this level. So, because this is a Kantian, for huge tracts of it, the senior just, you know what, just don't do it. Any signal at all, unless you're sure it's totally harmless, just don't bother, don't do this. I won't incentivize this practice at all. Because ultimately, it's too expensive to get the senior to do it, and the junior doesn't want to do it either, and it's just the amount I have to pay them wipes out the profit, and the customer knows this is all coming, it's just not worth it. So over here, we just have the practice not going on. Which is why cultural assimilation, is no big deal here. You're just copying the senior who doesn't do it anyway, so nobody does it. Over here, that was that little bit where the senior, okay, senior, you don't do it because you're too expensive. I'll pay the junior to do it instead. So during the financial crisis, we had a lot of places where the most highly paid people were not the people on the board. They were like the heads of some desk trading something. And perhaps that's a situation where the board makes speeches about ethics, and they don't do the bad thing, and the head of the desk was the guy who just accepts the practice and just gets on with it. And that's what the principal knew and was incentivizing. Over here, as you go up there, we're now getting the senior is becoming a bit less precious about ethics, and so it becomes possible to incentivize the practice to be done, but always less than the surplus maximizing level, which is here at just a bit above 0.5. Okay, is the critical threshold where you wouldn't do it. So that's with sophisticated customers. What happens, so remember this was where we were before, what happens with unsophisticated customers, naive customers? Well, the acceptance region grows hugely. Okay? The rejection region is also quite big, but we'll have a look at what happens to the senior in a minute, and there's cultural assimilation. So the bit that stands out is just how, if the customer is not going to put a brake, how much it becomes, where it just, get the junior to just do this thing becomes a very important, notwithstanding the fact that we have a duty-based ethic. And what's the senior doing? Well, whereas before it didn't get up, now, over here, that yellow bit is the senior always does the practice. Unless, even if the signal is that this will definitely harm the customer, the bonus so highly, and their duty ethic, but their duties are just swamped by money. Over here, the senior is just a bit too difficult, too expensive, but the junior's cheap, so the junior does the practice thing, and over here it sort of rises so that the principal is doing more and more of it. Okay, so I'm going to conclude, and then we can have. So we've had a contracting model where we've got morally aware agents deciding whether or not to invoke the practice. Agents are going to be motivated by their compensation contracts and by the moral standards. What did we find? Well, with our act utilitarian framework, which which certainly seems quite widespread from what evidence we've been able to see, we had cultural assimilation came out as the unique equilibrium outcome, the junior copying the senior. And so importance of tone from the top does matter, we see that, but we also find that with customers are sophisticated, we have the practice being invoked an aggregate surplus amount, maximizing amount of time. Caveat emptor worked. Okay? And so bonus pay wasn't needed. But if we had an owner-manager, or if information was limited, or if owner-manager, or if information was limited, we found that we can get bonuses and excessive invocation. So we can get too much of the practice, and we get the malpractice going on. With naive customers, then all bets were off. Then the aim of the game then became to just use the bonus system to corrupt the agents, to just do as much of the practice as possible, because the break from the customer wasn't there. Now, if customers know a bit, but not as much as we sophisticated customers do, then you can imagine the break is sort of somewhere in between, and you get away to that bit. So we think one of the things that is interesting about this, and that this highlights, is in our model, bonuses do come up, except when everyone's got perfect information and they're fully sophisticated. Bonuses do become a robust feature of, even with act utilitarian agents, even when we have owner managers, when we don't have full information about incentives, and if you weave in the other assumptions as well. And yet these bonuses are very different to the usual reason that we have bonuses in our economic models. Usually it's about moral hazard and incentivizing behavior, sort of ethics, incentivizing people to exert effort. Now, these bonuses are designed to corrupt and to morph the contract, morph the culture into one which maximizes profits under the constraints that the firms